Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Surrey Art School studio. For those of you that are new to Sketchbook, my name's Ellie, and I am going to be your creative guide as we work our way through this new, beautiful project, Migration, over the autumn season. And the main focus of this project is going to be on visitors that arrive in the UK in the autumn, because I find we tend to focus on departures. We tend to think about birds that we're waving off that are heading further south for the winter. But I thought it would be really nice to focus on some of the lesser known birds that visit the UK in the autumn, for which the UK is a refuge for them from the harsher weather, perhaps further north. So we'll begin our journey today by looking at a couple of birds from the thrush family, and over the next couple of cycles we'll be looking at the redwing and fieldfare. And in this first cycle of the season, I am easing you in nice and gently, so please do not worry. All you're going to need is a pencil, maybe a fine liner, and the paints that we sent you in your subscription box, as well as some of the resources we included there as well. So I'll spend the first half of this first cycle of the season just sort of explaining how you might work with those resources, working our way through the paints, looking at some of the maps that we've sent you, and encouraging you to be, or to sort of be creative, or to find your own way to present some of that information, whether it be in a sort of small journal like this, or if you're choosing to work in a larger sketchbook. And sort of towards the end of this tutorial, I have time to do a little bit of bird sketching with you, and I promise I will develop that so much further in the second cycle. But we do have a look at the redwing, we have a look at things like the beak, the proportion around the head, we look at sort of how we can sketch that overall shape, and we have a little look at the pattern of the plumage as well. So lots to sink our teeth into creatively in this first cycle, but a deliberately gentle start to the season, because I know that after sort of a busy summer, it takes a little while to settle back into our practice. So I'm giving you this invitation to go gently this season, to take this journey one step at a time, one breath at a time, and just a reminder that we are not looking for perfection here. A little bit of progress over the season is great, but I'm not expecting you to be masters of any of the subjects that we look at just yet. We're going to slowly and gently develop and build those skills through the season. So I hope you've enjoyed sort of sinking into the theme so far, and I really look forward to seeing what you do with some of the information that I'm offering up, and also some of the techniques that I'm offering up during this first cycle, as we sort of gently stretch our wings, do some little warm-up exercises, and prepare to lift off a little bit later on in the season. I will be back in a couple of weeks with the next part of this journey, and you can expect a lot more sketching, a lot more in-depth study of whole birds during that session. But for now, let's just make a gentle start, shall we? So much love. Okay, my loves, the autumn season is here, and it's time for us to make a start on our beautiful new project, Migration. So obviously we're going to be covering quite a few different birds over the next few cycles, different shapes of birds, different types of beaks. And what is incredible about birds is how they've evolved to have some very specific features around things like their plumage, their colouring, and the variety is absolutely incredible. So before we start, I just want to talk through some of the stuff we sent you in your subscription box. Don't worry if you didn't get the subscription box. This is a sort of good idea for you to see what it is that we're working with during this season, and then I'll talk through how you might use some of the materials as well. So in terms of the tea, you can put the kettle on and you can make yourself a brew of this lovely relaxing tea whenever you like. And so it's just a really nice place to start, is to get yourself into a sort of calm space. And just know that I'm going to be really gently guiding you through this project. So you don't need to be an expert right now at drawing or painting birds. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have all the skills right now. We will build on them and develop them through the season. So we've sent you some beautiful colours to complement the season. Just picked out some of the sort of main colours of some of the birds that we're going to be working with this season, and I'll talk you through how to sort of test those out, but also if you don't have the subscription box, some ideas as to how you could maybe mix some of these paints yourself or create your own little palette for the autumn season. And then in addition to that, we've sent you quite a few printed maps onto different materials. So this is onto our grey crush, which is just sugar paper really, just grey sugar paper. And we've printed a few on there for you, and we've also printed some sort of global maps and some Europe maps onto white paper. We thought this might be really nice and easy if you wanted to photocopy them and reuse them throughout the season, and I'll show you during this cycle how I've sort of made a start with using these maps in my sketchbook. And then in addition to that, we've sent you a couple of blue tint watercolour paper sheets. These are just, will come in handy a little bit later on in the season. They're just samples, there's something to play with. You may want to trace down the outline of a bird and have and explore with those, but we'll definitely come back to those a bit later in the season, maybe like cycle 3. So I'm just going to pause and get myself set up. I'm going to get some water for my paints and just some plain paper. A lot of the stuff that I have in my sketchbook, I'm sort of going to reproduce on a larger scale here, and then invite you to choose the way that you want to present and lay out your work in your sketchbook or your research as well as your work, okay? So I'm just going to reset for a second. I'll come back to you in 2 minutes, and I'm going to get these paints out and talk them through with you, okay? Okay, I've realised that I didn't talk about the postcard, but I'll come back to that, I promise. I just want to talk about the paints that we've got available to us first and some alternatives for you. So you can see in my sketchbook that I have taken all of the colours that are in this season's subscription box and just got them out onto a page in my sketchbook. It's really useful to sort of have a record of these colours and what they look like, especially when they've dried onto paper, because we can come back and when we're looking at particular birds, we can sort of draw from this list, but you may want to add more colours to that list, and that is completely up to you. Now, something that people often miss with these little dot cards that we send you is that just behind the paints here, tucked in very neatly by our Nikki, is the name of all the different paints that we've chosen for you, and they should be exactly where they are on the dot card, okay? So hang on to this little piece of paper. It's very valuable. It will really help you with getting an understanding of these paints. And I've just got some regular watercolour paper here. You could just do this on paper. You can see it worked really well just in my octopus sketchbook. And then I've got a little brush, and I've just wet, so I've just taken a little drop of water and popped it down onto each of those paints just to soften them off. So these are all sort of normal paints, and this one is a glaze, and that will come in handy again a little bit later on in the season, so don't worry about that too much for now. So I'll start with my burnt tiger's eye. It's been softening for a minute. I want to make a sort of basic glaze. I'm going to pull that out across my paper, maybe a little bit thin, so I'll just mix it a little bit more to get it a little bit thicker. So I'm going to pop that down on the paper just to see what it looks like. I'll also wet a little area of the page, take a little bit more of that paint and drop it in just to see how it performs wet on wet. And then finally, I'll try and mix a slightly thicker mix, just see if I can get sort of to the richest tone of this paint, and I'll pop that down here. And this is just something to do sort of systematically at the beginning. It sort of gets you acquainted with the palette of colours. I'm going to start with all my browns. So this is, the first one was Burnt Tiger's Eye. It's a nice grainy texture that works really well for the bird's wings, and for the colours of the birds that we're sort of studying in these first couple of chapters, it's really fantastic. And then you've got transparent brown oxide. That's a slightly richer colour. It's a slightly more orangey tone, as you can see. So it's really good to pop them down side by side and get an idea of what they do. And again, I'm going to get a sort of slightly thicker mix, drag it across the page. It's quite orangey, that transparent brown oxide, quite a nice tone. And then just for a little bit of difference, I would do all your browns first, so Burnt Tiger's Eye, transparent brown oxide, and a little bit of burnt umber. Get those all down first so you can get an idea of just the different shades or tones of brown that are available to you for this season, for when we do get into our watercolour painting. That probably won't be today, by the way. And then finally, I've got some indigo here. We've worked with this colour before. It's a lovely, deep, rich tone. We'll mix it with things like blacks later on in the season to create more luminous paint. And I'm going to put a second swipe of that indigo down and just let that dry all the way down. I want that nice and thick and dark. And then when that dries completely, you can go into your interference blue, which is the last colour. It's not a colour necessarily, it's more of a glaze. And I'll just do it on my sketchbook here. Well, you can probably see actually, I don't know if you can see. But if I add it over the top of that indigo, it's giving me this lovely sort of luminous bluey tone. So it's shifting up the tone of the paint and giving it a little bit more of a shimmer, a little bit more of a reflection. So this is how I sort of palette test at the beginning, get an understanding of my colours. I do this with tons of colours before the season starts, and then I whittle it down to sort of 4 or 5 that I think are going to be really useful during the season. And in this first cycle of the season, we're looking at a bird called the Redwing. And the Redwing has got a little burst of warmth in its chest, just at the side on the flanks. So that colour there would be really useful for redwings. We may not use it during this cycle, but you may want to later on in the cycles come back and look at that redwing and use that colour. So we'll see how we go today. I always like to sort of start really gently with this stuff, ease you in, get you into a state of sort of play and exploration, and sort of get some pages filled nice and easily at the beginning so that you feel like you're moving forward, like you're making progress. So that's the paints. If you don't have the subscription box and those paints, I think most of you do this season, but just on the off chance that you just booked a sort of one-off payment for Sketch, then go to your pan palette of colours and see if you can find similar colours within your palette. So it's exactly the same. I drop some water onto the colours that I think are similar. So all these browns, but I know I've got like a deep rich blue somewhere as well. Like I've got a couple of blues in my palette that might work quite well. And then I also know that I've got some warm tones where if I don't have a really bright orangey tone, I can certainly mix one. So it's a case of being as methodical really, getting a little bit of that paint, pulling it out. That's actually not too far off the Burnt Tiger's Eye, that one there. And just having a look at it and seeing how it performs on the page. If you're using these sort of new palettes that we sell in the shop, then you should find they perform really similarly to the Daniel Smith paints. So just pulling them out, that one's way too red, but actually could be quite useful for that little bit of red on the flank. It's a little bit too warm. And just sort of working your way down and seeing if you can find the right brownish tones that you're going to need. So this one's a little bit more greyish, but again, it reminds me of the Burnt Tiger's Eye. So getting them out onto your page, and then once they're dry, just labelling them up with the names. I just used a 0.3 fine liner, I think, for this. Just gives me an understanding or a sort of basic palette to work from for this season as we go along. And once these have dried, you can go in and label them, but also look at them. I mean, look at the Burnt Tiger's Eye. Look what it does when it's sort of when it starts to dry. Look at that granulation there. Look at the texture it's creating, and then notice how different it is from your glaze, from when you've just pulled out a little bit of the paint to when you've worked with that paint wet on wet. And just noticing at this stage, not having to have all the answers, just playing and exploring in this first cycle with some of the materials that we've got available to us, and sort of getting things started in your sketchbook. And again, I'm working with the Octopus sketchbook this season, but whatever sketchbook you're working in, whatever works for you, is absolutely fine. We're not here to all follow exactly the same journey. I may give you the similar starting points, but you know, there is so much room for play and exploration here for you to sort of look at the birds and look at the subjects that we're covering, but also include your own if you want to at some point. Okay, so that's just a little taste of what's in the subscription box, and I'm going to carry that on by talking about the postcard now and some of the research that I've already put into my sketchbook. Okay. Okay, so getting started on sort of delving into some of the information in the postcard here. This is my title page. It's really simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. I've just used my stamps to make a title. I put a little wash in the background beforehand. I've stamped in a few birds because I had a little bird stamp. And then I've just sort of worked through the definition, which is on the postcard here, and sort of put it into my own words, just alternating a little bit between different colours or tones of fine liners, just to highlight some of the key information that I want to be on that page. So you can see that there, just my title page, just my ideas really. And you can add your own notes here, you can add your own thoughts on migration. I think it's really interesting that migration is a normal human activity, even though we have had a lot of sort of criticism of migrants over the last few years. It's something that humans have always done, moved from one place to another almost instinctively, or when they know that the resources are not sort of supportive of their survival. And that's exactly what birds do, you know. We call it instinct, but really what it is a sort of deeper inner knowing that they need to move in order to improve their chances of survival. So that link between humans and animals there, I think, is quite interesting. So you'll see some information on departures and arrivals. I'll put a little link in your resources as well. There is an actual departures and arrivals board which has been created by the RSPB, and it can give you a sort of wider understanding of, you know, the comings and goings over the autumn season, the winter season, and then as the birds choose to return home to breed in spring. So we are going to be starting by looking at two birds. We're going to look at the Redwing and the fieldfare, and you'll find some information on both of those in your sketchbook. And for today's lesson, we're just going to focus on some of the finer details. So we may just sketch heads, for example, and feet and beaks today, things that may cause a little bit of a stumbling block in terms of how you record them. So we're going to start small, and we will evolve this between the first and the second cycle into sketching some whole birds, if that makes sense to you. Also just wanted to say, for those of you that are a bit wonky with your handwriting or a bit wobbly, there's a few things you can do when you're sort of recording research in your sketchbook. What I did actually with this is I just used my postcard like this, and then grabbed my pen and sort of wrote along the top of the postcard, just as a way of keeping my handwriting in check so that it wasn't sort of flowing all over the page. Of course, you can be very playful with text as well, but that really helped me. Or again, you could just get a ruler and you could put some pencil lines in once you've added your wash in your background, and just sort of give yourself some guidelines for writing. Just because I know people can get a little bit sort of want their sketchbooks to be quite tidy, but it's not something I aim for. But I know for some people that things like that can help, either using the postcard to help you keep your lines straight, or just drawing a few lines out, just a few guidelines. And I like to let these pages sort of evolve. I don't have a set plan when I start. I just put the title in, put a wash down, let that dry, and then I just play. So I've done a little cloud here, but just anything really. You could collage into this page. You could, just do your own free writing in the background and then cover it up with bits of colour. There's loads of different ways that you could do that starter page. It's completely personal, and there is no right or wrong way. So I just wanted to make that really clear. So I'm going to talk through the maps now and a little bit of the information about the Redwing, and then we will get on to some sketching, I promise. Okay? So yeah, just bear with me as we lay the foundations of this project. Every single cycle won't be the same as this, but sort of getting things together so that we can lift off in the same way at the beginning of the project is quite important. And some of this stuff I won't need to come back and revisit it in the later cycles, but just trying to give you some structure as you sort of make a start on this, especially if you haven't done Sketchbook Club before. So you will find a slide that has loads of information on the Redwing. We actually ended Did we end the summer season? No, we ended the winter season on the Thrush family. So I just felt it was nice to come back to them. And the redwing is the smallest of all the birds in the thrush family. They're not native to the UK. They migrate from Scandinavia, from the north. It's very, very similar to fieldfares, who do almost exactly the same journey from Northern Europe down into into the UK, some just settling in Scotland where there's a few breeding pairs, but some moving a little bit further south and even into sort of the north of France and areas like that. So our redwing population goes from sort of a few breeding pairs in the winter in Scotland to 69,000 birds during the winter. So there certainly is a lot to look out for there in terms of the redwing. And it's a great time to get to know them because they'll be arriving late September, early October, which is about where we are now. So again, in terms of the information and how you record it, it is completely up to you. I've sort of put in the arrivals and departures time, and a bit like our plant medicine project, I've put the scientific name in. I've also included where they are on the conservation list. They're now amber on the conservation list, and I think that's because of the breeding pairs that we're starting to see in Scotland, or starting to grow in Scotland, or have done over the last 100 years. I've put in what they like to eat as well, and I've just done some little sketches, really loose, really simple, of some of the stuff that they like to eat. So they very much enjoy their berries and their fruit, but also they really enjoy the sort of invertebrates, caterpillars, snails, worms, all those kind of things. And we'll talk about their beaks later on, or the bill, but that really relates to the diet, so that's quite interesting, I think. And yeah, you'll see them a little bit later on in the season in open spaces, and you will see them alongside the fieldfare, which is why I wanted to group the two birds together at this stage. They're often confused one for the other, and they're actually very different in scale, but you will see them a lot together if you do get to see them in the UK over the autumn season. And just very quickly wanted to talk through one of the maps that I've created. And this map would probably be just as suitable for the redwing as it is for the fieldfare, because they make a similar journey from Scandinavia down to the UK. And how I've worked with it is really simply, I know that this is pastel paper. I sort of re-upped on my geography here because I wanted to remind myself of exactly what countries I was looking at from this blank map. So that was quite helpful for me. And then all I've done is I've sort of shaded in, just using a bright pastel, the areas which the fieldfare comes from, and I've just sort of done some arrows down to the UK. So that will, the redwings and the fieldfares. So we can add the fieldfares in at a later stage, or we can just assume they're both coming from a very similar area. And interestingly enough, the ones that come from Iceland tend to just stay in the north of the UK. So this is a mapping project in many ways. It's about journeys and distance and destinations. It's about our instinct to move and to travel, and that feels very aligned with where I'm at right now. After 3 years of sort of sitting still, I've suddenly find myself in movement. I find myself travelling and moving, and I've got a trip coming up later on this season, which is quite significant, but I'll talk about that another time. So just getting into the theme here, you can see some of the studies that I've done so far. What I absolutely love about this octopus sketchbook is how quick it is to fill pages. But if you've got a bigger sketchbook with bigger pages, maybe just divide it into 4 so that you can feel like you're making progress on each area quite quickly. So we're going to get into some sketching now. I've got a few sketches on here. I've done a lot of bird sketching over the last couple of weeks, sort of getting to know these beautiful creatures and getting to understand specifically the sort of shape of the head of the redwing and its different expressions. So we're going to go into a little bit of sketching now. I'll do some in pencil, but I'll probably do some in pastel too, because I actually find for the birds it's a lot easier to work in pastel actually, and on a slightly larger scale. So I'm just going to reset, and I will be right back to do some sketching with you. Okay? Okay, so let's get this party started. We're going to do our first little birdie sketch here. I'm using just a blue sketching pencil. It just makes it a little bit easier for you to see what I'm doing. I'm keeping my hand sort of quite flat onto the table. You can probably hear that little swoosh that is just allowing me to have some control. If you lift your hand like this, you're going to be a lot looser. But if you just sort of lay your pencil down in your hand like this, as if it's having a little rest, and you start to sketch, what we're looking for is like a sort of flat bean shape. Now the shape of a bird's head changes according to these feathers a little bit. So in this image, my redwing has got quite a flat head, but we may find in some scenarios that it is a little bit raised in this area, and that's because there's a load of plumage around the cheek, and that can lift up and create like a little ruffle. So worth knowing, but not essential at the same time. So this is the first little shape that we want to put in, is just that sort of overall shape of the head, a sort of flat lozenge shape. And then we're going to look at sort of the beak in line with the eye. So we've got this sort of angle that we can transfer from the beak to the bottom of the eye, and we can just pop that in. You're going to do this in pencil. I'm just doing it in blue so you can see it a little bit better. That guideline is going to be really helpful to you. And as we go along, we're going to sort of get into sort of the whole body sketching. But for now, this will do. And then if you're drawing sort of directly, you can even measure from the point of the beak to the middle of the eye. So from the point of my beak to the middle of my eye is actually almost exactly where my line ends, just coincidentally. And so I can very loosely sketch in the shape of the eye. They look a bit odd at first, all right, so please do persevere with this. And then we're going to sort of cut away from this shape to sort of try and find this true shape of the head. So first of all, I'm going to measure the whole length of my beak, and that finishes about here, which is quite close to the eye. So these little measurements really help. And then the top of the beak here finishes about here. So all I'm doing is I'm using my pencil as like a measuring tool, and where my thumb is sort of the end of the measurement, if that makes sense. So this is where the start of the shape of the head begins. And again, I can measure the angle if I want to, so you can keep checking. And I'm going to do sort of lots of little lines up to the top of the head and then back, and that's where my image ends. So there's like a little bump there, so I'm just going to honour that little bump. And then I need to get in that shape of the beak. So generally there's a little bit of plumage here, especially on the redwing, that connects the beak, and then there's a little hole just there for a nostril, and then we can find the shape of the top of that beak. Okay, and then the sort of bottom jaw of the beak comes in about here. Now you may also find that your birds look a little bit cross at the beginning. We'll work on that, okay, but they may look a little bit angry. Now I'm just going to adjust the shape a little bit because my eye is a little bit flat, so I'm just going to make it like a little bit rounder at the top. There we go. And then my beak is sort of coming in here, and there's almost like a V shape where that plumage comes in, and then from there I can see the angle of the jaw coming back and into the front of the chest. There's a sort of little overlap there, so it doesn't look really much like a redwing at the moment, but it will as we continue to sort of work it up. So the beak's in, they have these sort of long pointy beaks, and we'll do a bit more detail on those later on. And then around the edge of the eye there are some really small feathers, so we're going to work those in. I'm just doing little smiley faces here around the edge of the beak. And then there's a sort of bigger shape. I don't know if you can see it on my image, but it looks a bit like this. And that is an area of plumage in its own right, which sort of chops and changes. So we're going to just sort of dot that in. It looks something like this. And it stops at the top of the eye, about here. And then all the other feathers sort of go off following their own direction. It's maybe like a secondary one of those about here. So that gives you the sort of overall spacing and shape of the eye, and then we're going to sort of work into it now. So my sort of best solution at this stage is to use a fine liner. It's just a little bit easier to work with, and it just gives us a nice clear outline. This is the idea behind this one, is that you can make a little sketch of the Redwing's head in your sketchbook. So just going to follow along the line of that beak. And again, we're going to get better at our bird sketching as we go along. So please don't panic if things are not looking perfect at this stage. I'm going to follow back over that line of the top of the head. I'm going to sort of retrace and perhaps even correct ever so slightly that angle just under the chin. And then I'm going to sort of put this eye in. I'm just going to double check the measurements on that, because from the end of the beak to the beginning of the eye, I just think I need to move my eye over a little tiny bit. So for the eye, I'm going to leave just a little highlight like that. Again, it makes them look a bit crazy, and then I'm going to block in the rest. For now, just so that I'm getting a sense of the bird, but without having to do too much at this stage. So in goes the eye. If you completely lose the highlight, don't worry. You can just put a little blob of gel pen. That looks so much better already. Now his eye is in. You can just do a little bit of gel pen or a little daub of white gouache. That is more than okay. And then I'm going to pop in his little nostril, which I'd already sort of sketched out. This is already looking much more birdy. It's making me feel a little bit better about things. Oh, and there's just one more thing that makes the Redwing really distinctive, and that's that stripe of sort of a creamy white tone on the top of the head. So, and it's sort of just above the eye. So if I pop that in here, that is just like a little note to self to leave that area. Obviously, you can remove all these pencil marks afterwards. I can't because of the way that I've done this, but you can definitely remove those pencil marks. So now I'm just going in and looking a little bit more closely at that image. This is absolutely on the resources, this image. You can see it in colour there. My printer's not really working this week, but it's Mercury retrograde, so I'm very accepting of that. So I'm just going to put in those tiny little bits of plumage around the eye, and I'm going to just put in as well a little bit of dotting on the beak, just on the darkest areas. Just makes me feel like I'm getting towards a more finished study. So with the Redwing, it has quite a dark upper beak or bill, and quite a dark black lower beak or bill until it gets to a sort of yellowy tone here. So, and then I'm just going to go back over some of those little areas that I marked out for the plumage. And actually, I've just spotted there's another little light patch just underneath the eye. So I'm just going to dot that out as well. So we're sort of step by step getting an understanding of sort of the patterns of plumage, and that can feel a bit complicated at first. It makes more sense. It will make more sense as we go along. I'm trying to get you familiar with some of those shapes and patterns at this early stage, so that it feels a bit less overwhelming when we move into some slightly more complex birds. So for me, the Redwing is a bit like the sparrow. Oh, and also the Redwing's got little whiskers here, so let's pop those in. These little whiskers help them to catch insects that are sort of flying by. So they're said to be like feathers, but really they are like little whiskers. Okay, so you could continue as well and do a little bit of mark making here just to show the direction of the plumage. And again, around here I can see some like little wispy shapes. So you can build up this drawing as much as you like, but just know this is just the first one. It's the first pancake. So it doesn't need to be perfect, my loves. It really doesn't need to be perfect. We are all just learning and growing through this process of exploring. Okay, so now I've got a sort of rough bird shape. Somebody said that my birds look quite angry. And I said, you would be angry too if you were on the amber conservation list. But I think it's something to do with the eye and also how we work up the beak. So I hope to improve and get less angry birds as we go along as well. I am on this journey with you, my loves. Okay, so at this stage, I would probably encourage you to rub away any extra pencil marks that you might have. Once you've gone over those sort of mapped areas, once you've added a little bit of mark making, I would encourage you to wipe out those lines. And then if you want to, if you're feeling a bit bolder, then we could add a little bit of colour to our study. So I'm just going to pause and then I'll come back and then we'll have a go at that. Okay. Okay, so at this stage you should have removed all of your extra pencil lines. Obviously mine are still there. It's quite useful reference actually, I think, to have those lines so you can just see how I sort of built up the structure of this little bird. And I thought it'd be really nice to add a little bit of colour to it, just so that you can create a little study that can go onto your title page, and you've seen mine, or onto your early research page on the Redwing. So keeping these lines sort of dotted and loose is quite important actually, because it sort of suggests the feathers, it suggests the plumage. So there are a couple of completely white stripes or creamy areas on the Redwing. So you've got the choice just to leave those blank, or I did notice that in my pan palette of colours, I do actually have a white. It's quite unusual to have a white in watercolour, but we've got one. So let's work with it, shall we? So it's sort of a creamy white, I would say. And my paints, because they're sort of slightly merging anyway, are sort of doing the job for us. This is just a size 6 brush, by the way. So a little bit of yellow has worked its way already into my white, which is actually really great. If you haven't got a white in your palette, it's quite unusual, like I said, for watercolour palettes, but these big ones do have one, which is cool. Then just use some white gouache to block out these areas. But I can just go in, and it's going to be really subtle, but it is going to sit quite nicely underneath some of the other colours that I'm adding. So I'm popping a little bit in here, a little bit in that area around the eye. I definitely need some down here, so I'm going to block it in because it's going to sit underneath. Just getting some more paint. It's going to sit, and actually it's quite opaque, this white. I quite like it. It's going to sit underneath some of the other plumage that we put in. So yeah, I think a creamy white is actually quite nice. Just add a tiny bit of yellow from the next door neighbour in the paint palette department. And it's really useful to put this underneath before you start to add any other paint. If I haven't said underneath enough, I'll just say it one more time. So we're going to put that as a sort of underlayer. It's going to sit below the surface. And I'm going to pop it all the way around there, and then we'll just let that dry. So no perfection at this stage. And then in terms of a brown for the plumage, well, actually, let me just put in the beak quickly. So most of the beak is black, but there's a little hint of sort of a warmer yellowy tone there. So I can just go to the next colour in my pan palette. This sort of yellow tone is quite light. In fact, I've got a fair bit of it here already. So just the next one along on my palette. You sort of need to do this a little bit by eye. I'm going to water it down a little bit. And then I'm just going to add a little hint of yellow. I'm not thinking that's warm enough actually. So let's go to the next one along. And this is what painting is. It is just trial and error. It's getting colours out. It's testing them. Let's have a look at it on the page. Yeah, that's a little bit more vibrant. Sort of a hint of what you see in the blackbird, which is also in that thrush family. And I can put more yellow than I need because I can always cover it up with the black afterwards. So let's go for that. It does look a bit angry, my bird, but I'm going to be all right with that. It's okay. Hopefully I can get some softness in as we go along. It's sort of, this is a process for us all. Okay, so then we just need to add some brown. And I'm going to suggest you do that in a nice, quick and easy way. I've got some burnt tiger's eye here, or I've got burnt umber. Both of those would match really nicely for the Redwing. I'm going to go for the burnt tiger's eye just because it's a little bit of a cooler brown and I really like it as a tone. And what I'm going to do for the plumage is just this. I'm just going to sort of press and lift like this, so get these sort of dotty shapes. Sometimes helps if your brush is a little bit drier, and I'm just going to just pop some in there. So I'm just leaving little gaps allowing it to sort of meld over into some of those white areas, leaving little gaps as I go along, picking up little bits of that burnt tiger's eye, being okay with it sort of splitting and spreading, and sort of using the tips so that I'm getting sort of less soft edges, if that makes sense. So I'm only pressing about half the brush in order to create that shape. And I'm going to work that, and this is going to start to make it feel more like a Redwing, I think, once we get some of those colours and tones in. So I'm just going to pull some through around the edges of the eye and start to get a sense of that plumage. So you might want to wait until your study is a little bit drier, but I am determined to take the plunge today to spread my wings and start to sort of work in some of these things that I've learned and get this project going for you today. So, and again, we can close off that shape there, and we're always sort of following the direction of the shape of the bird's head. So the plumage sort of wraps around the overall contour, and just sort of popping some of that light brushwork in, giving a sort of hint of the plumage that we might see on the Redwing. And as we sort of get down into the body, some areas are quite brown, like here, and then there are like little stripes of sort of cream sort of coming through, and it gets a little bit more patchy as we go down the neck. So I'm sort of building the shape up a little bit here as I go as well. And so here we want lots of little tiny, very light pressure with your brush, just lots of little tiny brush marks in that brown, just to sort of show the pattern of the plumage on the chest. Okay, so that is pretty much it. I probably will just go into my black now, just right at the edge of my normal pan palette, and then just add a little bit of that in, just to finish off that little part of the beak. Again, this is like the first pancake of the season. It's the first study. If you can, leave a little line, leave a little highlight between the top and the bottom of the beak. These are tweezer-like beaks. So again, they are adapted, like all bird beaks, to suit what it is they eat, which I think is quite interesting, and I'll share more on that if I have time during this cycle. But for a first study, albeit a little bit severe, I don't think that's too bad, and it just gives you a chance to have a little play with some of the paints that you've got, get familiar with the paints in your palette. Using the fine liner just allows a little bit more freedom as well. It just means that you can sort of work over the top of your lines and still feel that there's some structure there, you know. And I think it's good enough for a first attempt at rendering this very sweet little bird, this very brave little bird that sets off from, you know, from Scandinavia. Just one sunset, they will all just set off and they will fly right across the sea without really much more than sort of their sort of inner compass, I suppose, guiding them. And that's what it feels like for me sometimes being on this path. It's just like, just got to be brave enough to jump off that branch and know that my wings will carry me. So there we go, a real simple, or not simple maybe, but a start to our sort of bird studies and understanding the proportions of the bird and how we might just add a little bit of colour to it, something that we can then include in our sketchbook pages alongside our research. So I hope you've enjoyed that little exercise, my loves. Okay, folks, so I was hoping to get a little bit more into this first cycle of the season, but I think it's good to make a gentle start. I don't want to overwhelm you at the beginning. So just to show you, this is where I actually did my little Redwing head study into my sketchbook, and then used just a few colours in the background just to highlight certain bits of information. The idea for me when I'm creating my sketchbook pages is like a reference point, something that I can use to come back to remind me, to stimulate my learning. So here I've also just done a little bit of labelling of just like the crown, the supercilium, the orbital feathers, which is what I was talking about, which are around the eye here, the nape, the bill, the throat, the breast. So I've left you a little diagram of the whole of a bird, and you might want to just start by familiarising yourself with the main terms around the head of the bird and around the plumage to begin with, okay? And then on one of my later pages, I've done a little page on breeding habits as well, and I've done a little sketch of a redwing using very similar techniques to what I did in that mini study for you. I'm not expecting you to be able to draw the whole bird at this stage, let me be clear on that. But you'll find in the resources lots and lots of different images of the birds. Mine are just printed in black and white right now with lots of different angles. So you might find to begin with that something like a little bit of trace down paper is really helpful, just so that you can get the image of the bird. You can see the one I worked from here into your book and get a little bit of that, more of that research down onto paper. I even did some little studies of the redwing eggs and talked about their breeding habits, because that's really important to their conservation, not conversation. That's really important to their conservation, is understanding that there are some breeding pairs in the UK, and that is why they've been moved from the red to the amber list, is because they are adapting to this new climate. They're adapting and finding new places to breed. And even though they're just in small numbers, for me that's a little grain of hope. So this is trace down paper, or you can use tracing paper. It's just got this graphite-y surface, and what you do is you sort of flip it round like this, pop your image on top, and then just trace the outlines. And I actually think tracing is really good at this stage because birds are quite complex. It enables you to sort of start to get an understanding of the shape of the head and things like the throat and the breast, but also an understanding of the wings, which we'll get into a lot more detail on in the later parts of this project. I sort of thought when I started this project, oh yeah, we'll do some birds, that'd be really fun and really easy. Actually, I think we're going to take it quite slow this season, take our time getting to know the different aspects of the bird. So the plumage is a whole lesson in itself, I feel. So I just wanted to say, to have a look at some of the studies and some of the images of my pages in the resources so that you can start to build that up. Now, I did manage to find a cast of redwing legs. I couldn't find any actual pictures of their legs on the internet, but I did find a cast. So I worked from that to do a little study, and I also did a little further study of their beak. But don't worry, we're going to come back and we're going to look in more detail at the beak and the feet and the overall shape of the redwing and the fieldfare in the next cycle. So one little bit of information that you need for the next cycle: we are going to be using this toned paper to sketch on in the next cycle. You don't have to have the grey crushed paper. You can work on black sugar paper, you can work on whatever sugar paper you've got. But having a toned paper is going to be really important, because what it does is it sort of fills in the middle ground. When we sketch on white paper, the birds can look quite empty and quite stark. But when we sketch on this, the image, the sort of drawing comes together a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. And I'm going to be working with pastel pencils in the next cycle. So at the very least, you need a burnt umber pastel pencil, and you're going to need a white pastel pencil. You may already have a set of pastels at home that you don't use, and I will be using one of my own sets of pastels as well to fill in the gaps colour-wise. But you definitely need a white and you definitely need a brown. Ideally, a sort of yellowish tone like this one as well. It's sort of a turmeric tone, is really good for the beak, and a grey tone is going to be really useful for the fieldfare. And again, some of you regular subscribers may already have these pastel pencils. If you don't have them, make sure you've at least got, like I said, a brown pastel pencil, and maybe a charcoal pencil, and a white coal pencil would be really helpful for the next cycle. Okay, so I just wanted to pop that in there. at the end. And in the next cycle, we'll look at beaks, we'll look at feet, and we'll look at sketching the whole bird. And we're going to be doing a lot of pastel work. So if you don't have those materials right now, I'll write them onto the resources, and make sure you pick them up or something similar. It doesn't have to be from our shop. This is no hard sell. It's more making sure you've got the right equipment for the next cycle. But yeah, make sure that you've got those ready for cycle 2, which will be coming out in 2 weeks' time. So I hope you've enjoyed this very gentle introduction to the redwing as a bird, to birds in general, to the overall theme of migration. Quite a lot to cover in this first cycle, just in terms of getting the ball rolling, getting started, sort of stretching our wings perhaps before we fully take flight. But it's been a pleasure to prepare this for you, and I really hope you enjoy some of the little exercises that I've suggested in this first very gentle cycle of the autumn season. So much love, my friends, so much love.